The norm is for everyone to die together? Very glad that I'm still alive? Fortunate that I'm still alive? Klein shivered and quickly ran to the door, trying to catch up with the policeman and ask for protection. But as soon as he reached the handle, he suddenly stopped. That officer talked so horribly about it. Why didn't they protect me, an important witness or key lead? Isn't that too careless? Were they just probing me? Or maybe it's a bait. All kinds of thoughts rushed into Klein's mind. He suspected that the police were still secretly watching him, observing his reaction. He felt much calmer after thinking of this and was no longer so panicked. He slowly opened the door, deliberately shouting with a trembling voice at the staircase, "You guys will protect me, right?" Tap. 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 There was no response from the police officers. And there was no change in the rhythm of the contact between the leather shoes and the wooden stairs. "I know. You'll do that," Klein shouted again in a tone of feigned conviction, trying to act like a normal person that was in danger. The sound of footsteps gradually weakened and disappeared into the bottom floor of the apartment. Klein snorted and laughed. Isn't that response too fake? Their acting skills are not up to standard. He did not run after them. Instead, he turned back to the room and closed the door behind him. In the next few hours, Klein fully expressed what they called back in Foodaholic Empire, China. Restlessness, nervousness, agitation, inadvertence, and murmuring words that he did not understand. He did not slack just because there was no one around. This is called the self-cultivation of an actor. He laughed at himself in his heart. When the sun moved to the west, the clouds on the horizon appeared to be reddish-orange. Tenants in the apartment came home one after another. Klein shifted his focus elsewhere. Melissa is almost done with school. He looked at the stove, lifted the kettle, peeled off the coal, and took out the revolver. Without pause or delay, he reached to the back of the board under the double-decked bed where more than 10 wooden strips were staggered out. After clipping the left wheel between a piece of wooden strip and board, Klein straightened up and waited uneasily, fearing that the police would burst open the door and rush into the room with guns in their hands. If it was an age of steam, he was certain he would not be seen by anyone when he did that. However, there were extraordinary powers here, ones that he had proven through his own experiences. After waiting for a few minutes, there was no movement at the door. There was only the chatter between two tenants who were heading for the Heart of the Wild bar on Iron Cross Street. Phew, Klein exhaled, feeling assured. All he needed to do was wait for Melissa's return and cook the stewed mutton with tender peas. When the idea came to Klein's mind, his mouth seemed to taste the rich flavor of the gravy. He remembered how Melissa cooked stewed mutton with tender peas. First, she boiled the water and stir-fried the meat. Then she added onions, salt, a little pepper, and water. After a specific period of time, the peas and potatoes were added and the stew was to be cooked for an additional 40 or 50 minutes with the lid on. It's indeed a simple and crude way to do it, supported purely by the flavors of the meat itself. Klein shook his head. But there was no other way about it. It was hard for commoners to have many kinds of condiments and various cooking methods. They could only pursue simple, practical, and economical methods. As long as the meat was not burnt or spoiled, anything was good for people who could only eat meat once or twice a week. Klein was not a very good cook himself and ordered takeout food most of the time. But by cooking 3 or 4 times a week, after many weeks of accumulated practice, he had a passing standard and felt that he would not let the pound of mutton down. When Melissa comes back to cook it, it will be done after 7:30 p.m. She would be starving by then. It's time for her to see what real cooking is. Klein made an excuse for himself. First, he started the fire again, went to the bathroom to collect water, and washed the mutton. Then he took out the kitchen boards and knives before chopping the mutton into tiny chunks. As for the explanation for his sudden culinary skills, he decided to blame it on the dead Welch McGovern, who had not only hired a chef who was good at the mid-seashire flavor, but also often created his own delicacies and invited people to try them. Well, the dead cannot refute me. Nevertheless, TSK, this is a world with beyonders. The dead are not necessarily unable to speak. With that in mind, Klein was a little guilty conscience. He threw aside his confused thoughts and put the meat into the soup bowl. Then he took out the condiment box and added in a spoonful of the crude salt, half of which had begun yellowing. In addition, he cautiously took some black pepper grains from a special small bottle, mixing and marinating them together. He placed the saucepan on the stove and, while waiting for it to heat up, Klein rummaged for the carrots from yesterday and cut them into pieces with the onions he bought today. When he was done with his preparations, he took out a small can from the cupboard and opened it. There was not much lard left in it. Klein took a spoonful, put it in the pan, and melted it. He added in the carrots and onions and stirred it for a while. As the fragrance began to pervade, Klein poured all the mutton into the pot and fried it with care for a while. He should have added cooking wine in the process, or red wine at least. However, the Moretti family did not have these luxuries and could only drink a glass of beer a week. Klein had to make do with whatever was available and poured in some boiled water. After stewing for about 20 minutes, he opened the lid, put the tender peas and cut potatoes in it, and added a cup of hot water and 2 spoons of salt. He closed the lid, lowered the fire, and exhaled satisfactorily, waiting for his sister to reach home. As seconds turned into minutes, the fragrance in the room intensified. There was the allure from the meat, the rich smell of potatoes, and the refreshing scent of onions. The smell gradually mixed up, and Klein swallowed his saliva from time to time, keeping track of the time with his pocket watch. After more than 40 minutes, some not-so-brisk but rhythmic footsteps approached. A key was inserted, the handle was turned, and the door opened. Before Melissa came in, she whispered doubtfully, "Smells good." With her bag still in her hand, she stepped in and glanced over at the stove. "You made this." Melissa took off her veil hat and her hand paused mid-air, looking at Klein in astonishment. She twitched her nose and inhaled more of the fragrance. Her eyes quickly softened and she seemed to find some confidence. "You made this?" she asked again. "Are you afraid I'd waste the mutton?" Klein smiled and returned with a question. Without waiting for an answer, he said to himself, "Don't worry, I specifically asked Welch to teach me how to cook this dish. You know, he has a good cook." First time, Melissa's eyebrows creased subconsciously, but they were smoothed by the fragrance. "It looks like I'm talented." Klein laughed. "It's almost done. Put your books and veil hat down somewhere. Go to the bathroom and wash your hands and then get ready to taste it. I'm very confident about it." When she heard her brother's orderly arrangements and saw his gentle and calm smile, Melissa stood rooted at the door and failed to respond in her daze. "Do you prefer the mutton to be cooked longer?" Klein urged with a laugh. Okay. Melissa jolted back to her senses. With handbag and veil in each hand, she rushed into the room quickly. When the lid of the saucepan was uncovered, a sudden blast of steam appeared before Klein's eyes. 2 pieces of rye bread were already placed to the side of the mutton and tender peas, allowing them to absorb the fragrance and heat to become soft. By the time Melissa had packed her items, washed her hands and face, and returned, a plate of stewed mutton with tender peas, potatoes, carrots, and onions was already placed on the table. 2 pieces of rye bread, colored by a light dip into the gravy, were on their plates. "Come on, try it." Klein pointed to the wooden fork and spoon next to the plate. Melissa was still a little confused. She didn't refuse. She picked up a potato with her fork, put it into her mouth, and bit it lightly. The taste of the starchy potato and gravy fragrance flooded her mouth. Her saliva secretion went crazy as she gobbled down the potato in a few mouthfuls. "Try the mutton." Klein gestured at the plate with his chin. He had tasted it just now and thought it was barely at a passing standard. But it was enough for a girl who was inexperienced with what the world had to offer. After all, she only ate meat occasionally. Melissa's eyes were filled with anticipation as she carefully forked some mutton. It was very tender and, as soon as it entered the mouth, nearly melted. The fragrance of the meat exploded in her mouth, filling it with delicious meat juices. It was an unprecedented feeling, and that made Melissa unable to stop eating. By the time she realized it, she had already eaten several pieces of the mutton. I, Klein, this was supposed to be prepared for you." Melissa blushed and stammered. "I'd nibbled some of the food just now. It's the privilege of being a cook." Klein smiled and soothed her sister. He picked up his fork and spoon. At times he would eat a piece of meat and sometimes he would stuff his mouth full of peas. At other times he would put down the utensils, break off a piece of rye bread and dip it in gravy. Melissa relaxed and was immersed in the delicacy again by Klein's normal behavior. It's really delicious. It doesn't seem like you were doing it for the first time. Melissa looked at the empty dish and praised him with all her heart. Even the gravy was finished. It's a long way from Welch's chef. When I'm rich, I'll take you and Benson out to the restaurant and have a better meal, Klein said. He was beginning to look forward to it himself. Your interview. Burp. Melissa did not finish her words because she suddenly let out a sound of contentment involuntarily. She put her hand over her mouth in a hurry and looked embarrassed. The fault is with the stewed mutton with tender peas just now. It was just too delicious. Klein laughed secretly and decided not to make fun of his sister. He pointed to the plate and said, "This is your mission." All right. Melissa stood up immediately, took the basin and rushed out the door. When she came back, she opened the cupboard to check the condiment box and other items as per normal. Did you just use them? Melissa was surprised and turned to Klein, holding the black pepper bottle and lard can. Klein shrugged his shoulders and laughed. Just a little. It's the price of a delicacy. Melissa's eyes twinkled, her expression changing for a few moments before she finally said, "Let me cook in the future." You have to hurry up and prepare for the interview. You have to think about your job. Melissa, can you not rub my nose in it? Klein muttered inwardly. He felt a throbbing pain in his head. The amount of content Klein had forgotten was considered a lot, but neither was it negligible. The interview was in 2 days, so how could he find the time to make up for it? Furthermore, he was involved in such strange paranormal activity, so how would it be possible that he would be in the mood to revise? Klein gave his sister a perfunctory response and began putting on the appearance of studying. Melissa moved a chair over to sit beside him. With light shining from the gas lamp, she began working on her assignments. The atmosphere was serene. When it was almost 11 o'clock, the siblings bade each other good night and went to bed. Knock. 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 Poundings on the door roused Klein from his dreams. He peered out of the window to see the first glimmer of dawn. In a daze, he flipped over and sat up. Who is it? Look at the time now. Why didn't Melissa wake me up? It's me. Dunn Smith, a man with a deep voice outside the door, replied. Dunn Smith? Don't know him. Klein got off his bed and shook his head as he walked towards the door. He opened the door to see the gray-eyed police inspector whom he had met the day before standing in front of him. Alarmed, Klein asked, "Is there something wrong?" The policeman replied with a stern look, "We found a carriage driver. He testified that you had gone to Mr. Welch's place on the 27th, the day when Mr. Welch and Ms. Naya died. Furthermore, Mr. Welch was the one who paid for your transportation fees." Klein was startled. He did not feel a tinge of fear or guilt that one would expect from having his lies exposed. It was because he was not even lying. In fact, he was surprised by the evidence provided by Dunn Smith. On the 27th of June, the former Klein had indeed gone to Mr. Welch's place. On the night that he returned, he killed himself the exact same way as Welch and Naya did. Klein gave a forced smile and said, "This is insufficient evidence. It does not directly prove that I am associated with the death of Welch and Naya. Honestly speaking, I'm also very curious about the whole incident. I want to know what exactly happened to my 2 poor friends. But, I really can't remember. In fact, I have almost completely forgotten what I had done on the 27th. You may find it hard to believe, but I fully relied on the diaries I had written to roughly make a guess that I had gone to Welch's place on the 27th. You sure have great mental fortitude, Dunn Smith said while nodding. He showed not a trace of anger, nor was he smiling. You should be able to hear my sincerity. Klein looked him straight in the eye and said, I'm telling the truth. Of course, only part of it. Dunn Smith did not give an immediate response. He swept his glance across the room before saying slowly, Mr. Welch lost a revolver. I guess I should be able to find it here. Right, Mr. Klein? Indeed. Klein finally understood where the revolver had come from. A thought flashed in his mind and he came to the final verdict in an instant. He raised his hands halfway and retreated, leaving a path open. Then he signaled at the bunk bed with his chin. Behind the bedboard. He did not specifically mention that it was the bottom deck, as no one would normally hide things at the back of the bedboard on an upper deck. That would be too obvious for guests to notice at a glance. Dunsmith did not move forward. The corners of his mouth twitched as he asked, "Nothing to add on?" Without hesitation, Klein replied, "There is. Yesterday, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I realized I was laying on my desk with a revolver beside me. There was a bullet at the corner of the room. It was as if I had committed suicide, but due to a lack of experience of never having used a gun. Or maybe I was too scared at the final moment. Anyway, the bullet did not achieve the desired result. My head is still in its place. I am still alive now. And since then, I have lost some memories, including what I saw and did at Welch's place on the 27th. I'm not lying. I really can't remember. For the sake of being eliminated as a suspect. For the sake of getting rid of all these strange events surrounding him, Klein explained almost everything that had happened. Except the transmigration and gathering. Also, Klein was careful with his words, allowing every sentence to be amenable. Such as not revealing the fact that the bullet had hit his brains, but only mentioning that it did not achieve the desired result and that his head was still in its place. To others, these two statements might seem to convey the exact same ideas, but in reality they were like chalk and cheese. Dunsmith listened quietly, then said, "This corresponds with what I had surmised. It also corresponds with the hidden logic of similar incidents in the past. Of course, I have no idea how you managed to survive. I'm glad you believe in me. I don't know how I survived either." Klein heaved a small sigh of relief. "But Dunn threw out a conjunction. There's no use in me believing you. You are currently the prime suspect. You have to be confirmed by an expert that you have indeed forgotten what you went through. Or that you indeed have nothing to do with the deaths of Mr. Welch and Miss Naya." He coughed, his expression becoming serious. "Mr. Klein, I seek your cooperation on coming with me to the police station for the investigation. This should take roughly 2 to 3 days if it is confirmed that there are no issues with you." "The expert is here?" Klein asked blankly in return. "Didn't they say it would take another 2 days?" "She came earlier than expected." Dunn turned sideways, signaling for Klein to leave. "Allow me to leave a note," Klein requested. Benson was still away and Melissa had gone to school. He could only leave a note to inform them that he was involved in an incident associated with Welch so that they would not worry about him. Dunn nodded, barely minding. "All right." Klein returned to the desk. As he searched for paper, he began thinking about what was about to occur. Honestly speaking, he did not wish to meet the expert. After all, he had a bigger secret. In a place where there were 7 major churches. Under the premise that Emperor Roselle, who was suspected to be a transmigrator predecessor, was assassinated, a thing like transmigration usually meant having to go to court and enter arbitration. But without weapons, combat skills, or superpowers, he was no match for a professional policeman. What's more, a few of Dunn's subordinates were standing in the dark outside. Once they draw their guns and shoot at me, I'd be finished. Ugh, I'll take one step at a time. Klein left the note, grabbed his keys, and followed Dunn out the room. Along the dark aisle, for policemen in black and white checkered uniforms split into pairs and guarded them on both sides. They were very alert. Tap, tap, tap. Klein followed alongside Dunn as they went down the wooden stairs, which occasionally creaked in protest. Outside the apartment, there was a 4-wheeled carriage. On the side of the carriage, there was the 2 crossed swords and a crown police emblem. Their surroundings were crowded and bustling with noise as usual. "Go on up." Dunn signaled for Klein to go first. Klein was just about to step forward when an oyster seller suddenly grabbed a customer and claimed that he was a thief. Both parties wrestled and triggered a response from the horses, causing great chaos. An opportunity. There wasn't much time for Klein to think any further. He bent forward and dashed towards the crowd. Either shoving or dodging, he escaped frantically towards the other end of the street. Right now, for the sake of not meeting the expert, he could only proceed by going to the pier outside the city, taking a boat down the Tussock River and escaping to the capital, Backlund. The population was higher there, making it easier to hide. Of course, he could also get on a steam train, go eastward to the nearest Enmat harbor and take the sea route to Pritz, then towards Backlund. Not long after, Klein arrived at a street and made a turn onto Iron Cross Street. There were several carriages that could be hired. To the pier outside the city, Klein reached out his hand and hopped onto one of the carriages. He had thought through things clearly. Firstly, he had to mislead the police that were coming for him. Once the carriage was a suitable distance away from them, he would jump right off. Alrighty. The carriage driver tugged at the reins. Clop, clop, clop. The carriage left Iron Cross Street. Just as Klein was about to jump off the carriage, he noticed that it had turned into another road. It wasn't leading out of the city. Where are you going? Klein blurted in his momentary daze. To Welch's place. The carriage driver answered monotonously. What? Klein was at a loss for words. The carriage driver turned around, exposing his cold gray eyes. It was Dunn Smith, the gray-eyed policeman. You. Klein was flustered. Everything suddenly became a blur as though the world spun around him when he instantly sat up. Sat up? Klein looked around, confused. He noticed the crimson moon outside the window and the room being covered in a crimson veil. He reached out with his hand to feel his forehead. It was all moist and cold. Cold sweat. His back felt exactly the same. It was a nightmare. Klein heaved a sigh. All is well. All is well. He found it weird. He was rather clear-minded in his dream. He was even able to think calmly. After calming down, Klein looked at his pocket watch. It was only 2 in the morning. He got out of bed quietly and planned to head to the washroom where he could wash his face and empty his burgeoning bladder. He opened the door and walked along the dark corridor. Under the dim moonlight, he walked lightly towards the washroom. Suddenly, he noticed a silhouette outside the window at the end of the corridor. That silhouette was wearing a black windbreaker that was shorter than a coat but longer than a jacket. That silhouette was partly camouflaged in the darkness, bathing in the crimson moonlight. That silhouette turned around slowly, his eyes deep, gray, and cold. Dunn Smith.